You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. I'm your host, Yuri Rashkin, and I'm excited to be joined from the shores of Atlantic Ocean. Soviet Union's Russia's #1 rock critic, Artemy Troitsky. Welcome back to the program. So good to see you.
Hello, Yuri, and good afternoon or whatever. Good whatever, dear listeners.
Exactly.
And pardon my clumsy English, of course.
You are pardoned. Artemy, the topic of conversation that I would like to discuss with you today is something that is kind of developing in an interesting niche for this channel, and that is Russian secret services, KGB, FSB. There's so many letters, but I'm thinking, or listeners and viewers could be wondering, why am I discussing this topic with rock and music historian and critic and host of his own show on Radio Liberty? But yet there is a connection in a sense that music, rock music, and Soviet Union kind of has a history of being interconnected with secret police and music. So if you could kind of share your experience, that'd be great.
Okay, well, if we come to fundamental things, then it has to be said that in democratic countries like the USA and Canada and UK, Western Europe, and so on, most of culture, and I think the whole of so-called pop culture, have been always totally separated or almost totally separated from the state. The state never actively supported artists. They never invested money in them. You know, this was all, be it recording industry or Hollywood movies or, you know, all things of this kind. This was always private business. Could be small business, could be big business, but it was always private. The only part of culture which I think was and still is largely dependent on government deeds is academic culture. I mean, opera and ballet and big art museums and symphony orchestras and so on. They get grants, they get all kinds of support, financial support, first of all, from the state. In the Soviet Union and in all kinds of totalitarian and authoritarian countries, culture has always been in the focus of state interest because it was always considered by the state as a very important tool of the so-called ideological work. So, of course, in the Soviet Union, we've had the Department of Culture at ЦК KPSS, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, which was actually the organ which ran the whole country, with Politburo on the very top of it. Then we've had the Ministry of Culture, which was also almost almighty in the field of all kinds of cultural activities, be it music, visual arts, cinema, theater, whatever. So, you know, these kind of countries, they're called totalitarian exactly for this reason. They wanted total control over everything. And this total control also meant total control of the artistic and cultural life and atmosphere in the country. And indeed, you know, there's been a lot of dogmas introduced by the state. Like in the Soviet Union, first of all, there was the famous or infamous idea, concept of socialistic realism, the socialist realism, which meant first socialist, i.e. soaked and driven by socialist and communist ideas. B, realism. Realism means means realism, and all deviations from this were considered ideologically, culturally, and spiritually harmful. Be it anti-Soviet deviations and capitalist propaganda, or just being non-realistic. So many art forms, many art concepts of the 20th century, like expressionism, surrealism, and so on, symbolism, whatever, abstract painting, and so on, which indeed were not realistic at all, they've been also considered ideologically harmful. Now, these were the basics. And if we take the example of rock music, then it was a very scandalous matter from the very beginning, because rock and roll, of course, was invented and created and promoted in America, later Britain with the Beatles, and so on. So from the very beginning, rock music was considered an ideologically decadent and harmful invention. There were even articles in the Soviet press claiming that organizations like the CIA or MI5 and so on, that they've been promoting rock music and pushing it eastwards to the Soviet Union in order to disorganize Soviet youth, in order to apply chaos in their young minds. So indeed, rock music not from the very beginning. In the very beginning, it was simply sort of under the radar of KGB and so on, because in the 60s it was purely like a grassroots movement, garage bands, student bands, which only played at small student parties, in little cafes and so on. So it wasn't really feasible. But starting from the late 70s and especially in the early 80s, the authorities, they suddenly found out that there is some kind of dangerous monster living inside this musical underground. And this was because of several things. First, because the band started to sing in Russian instead of singing in English, which was, of course, the first wave of Russian rock bands. And when they sang songs in their native tongues, these songs were self-written, and indeed they were very much unlike the kind of official young communist pop songs which were promoted by the state and always on radio and TV and so on. The bands, like Машина Времени, Time Machine, or Aquarium, they sang about drugs, they sang about sex, they sang about alienation, and all this was, of course, absolutely unacceptable by the official Soviet cultural doctrine. So this was one thing. Another thing, which was in a way even more dangerous, is that this underground rock movement has created a huge network of underground illegal home taping. Because all classic Soviet rock bands, they were never on TV, never on radio. We've had a state monopoly, a record label called Melodia. So of course they were also not on record, but the kids, they found their own tricky ways to distribute this music, and this was home taping, and at least in the first half of the 80s, this was a huge phenomenon in the Soviet Union, and this, of course, was really dangerous for the state, because like in the 60s and the 70s, they had samizdat, the home copying of works by Solzhenitsyn, Aksionov, and other dissident writers. And here, again, the same thing, but on a much bigger scale. I mean, in samizdat, you could only, type like 10 copies. Here, in every family, there was a tape machine, and there were underground professionals called pisatели, or writers or recorders, who had dozens of magnetophones at their homes, and they've been rolling around the clock, making these recordings, which was later sent from Moscow and Leningrad to all Soviet cities. And this was also quite a successful commercial venture, because they didn't do it for free, of course. So because of all that, KGB became strongly interested in this phenomenon, and tried very hard, and partly successful, simply to destroy it. But again, there were different tactics in this struggle against rock, or the will to control underground rock music in the Soviet Union. In Russia, we call it knut и пряник, a whip and a muffin. So on one hand, there were all kinds of repressions. The concerts were banned. Some prominent rock musicians have been arrested. There were long and exhausting blacklists of underground rock bands, which were not allowed not only to perform in public, let alone on TV and radio, but even they've controlled the discotheques. So they wouldn't play a song by Kino or Aquarium or Машина времени at a disco. So there was a complete ban on public performances of rock music. But on the other hand, there was also quite a weird deviation from this repressive form, and this was the famous Leningrad Rock Club, created in 1981. And at that time, of all Soviet cities, Leningrad was boasting the most vivid and active underground music scene. So one fine day, the KGB decided that in order to control this whole movement, they have somehow to organize it. And although the initiative came from the grassroots, rock musicians, they wanted to legalize their activity somehow. And they came to young communist organizations, to trade unions, student organizations, and so on. And they suggested that let's create an umbrella organization for all those unofficial underground amateur rock bands. And then suddenly, as I said, in 1981, KGB said, "Yes, why not? Let's try to do it. This is a very kind of smart and cunning way to control the whole bloody thing." And this is how the Leningrad Rock Club was created. And of course, this was, in many ways, this was a cat and mouse game. And I must say that the mouse or mice, they have won because Leningrad Rock Club became the focus, the absolute center of all rock music movement in the Soviet Union. They've made regular concerts, they've made annual festival. There was a huge pilgrimage from the whole country to Ulica Rubinstein Street in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, of course. This was on one hand, I'm sure that the Leningrad KGB sent very optimistic reports to Moscow about how they control the whole thing. On the other hand, the whole thing got absolutely out of control, and the bands started to multiply, and they could do absolutely nothing about home taping and underground recording studios and so on. So by 1985-86, when Perestroika started to happen, I think that Soviet underground rock was one of the main beneficiaries of Perestroika, because thanks to its underground legend, they've skyrocketed from from all those attics and garages and shelters to concert halls and stadiums, and soon there was no KGB, but but all the famous rock bands were still there and enjoyed enormous success.
Now that is very interesting because it's a great story, and I'm trying to figure out because you were right there involved with Leningrad Rock Club, and you knew everybody who was involved there. Were they concerned about KGB having oversight, as in like on a management level, like this whole place runs somehow? There must be a reason why we're allowed to gather, and perhaps this is connected with KGB. But or there's probably everyday concerns that you were surrounded by people who could write things about you and complaints about you and turn you in for something, and that's got to be more than a little stressful too.
Well, I wouldn't say that the KGB in Leningrad Rock Club in particular has created a big stress for artists. They knew very well that the KGB guys are there, and they politely called them our curators. Now the curators, they curate, say, artistic exhibitions. Now the KGB curators, they've been curating underground rock concerts. And of course, those curators, they've made some problems for the bands, but the only real problem I can recall now is the fact that they've introduced censorship. So the rule of the Leningrad Rock Club was that each band had to submit all the lyrics. They weren't interested in music at all because, well, what is music? There's no words, so there's no ideology, no nothing. But they had to submit all the lyrics of their songs to the state and KGB appointed censors who worked at the Leningrad Rock Club. So these nice ladies, who've had, very nice relations with the artists, they read the lyrics and they said, okay, well, this line, it's too much. You shouldn't, you must change this. Like, well, I could give you many examples, but they all work well in Russian. There is a famous song by Mike Naumenko and his group, Zoopark, the Zoo, a song called You're a Bitch. Let's put it this way. And there was a line, baby, are you ready for the 5 seconds abortion? Which of course was quite rude and quite sexy. So after the censorship, but also of course, this is a typical rock and roll lyrics, yes? Sex and drugs and so on, and violence. So after the censorship, he had to sing in concerts, hey baby, you are breaking all the records. Which was, of course, much more polite. And there were hundreds of cases like this. But for every artist, the most important thing is to write and to perform and to see the audience before them. And this was the most important, most essential thing for everybody. So the musicians, they've taken a slightly cynical attitude to all this. They could swallow the KGB curators, they could swallow the censorship, but in return, they have got legal concerts, audience in different cities, and this was much more than what they've sacrificed.
It's so interesting. Artemy, thank you so much. I'm sometimes on Facebook and social media, actually a copy of picture will come up of bone records, which is X-rays that were used for
this was long before. This was long before.
Just the history of subversion.
The X-ray records on the bones, they've been killed by tape recorders. So they've been huge in the 50s and the very beginning of the 60s. But by 1965, 66, everyone had tape recorders. First the reel-to-reel recorders, then cassette recorders. And these made records on bones, on all these X-ray plates, absolutely useless.
Artemy, thank you so much for your time. And you're watching Rashkin Report.